Flight 637 sat at the end of runway 27R at Chicago O'Hare International Airport on a Friday evening in October. Its engines spooled up and ready for takeoff. Inside the Boeing 737, 153 passengers were settled in their seats, most absorbed in phones during the final moments before devices had to be switched off, a few looking out windows at the darkening sky. Aaron sat in seat 14A, watching ground crew vehicles move around the terminal in the distance, thinking about his weekend plans in San Francisco where he was heading for a friend's wedding. Everything felt routine, normal, safe. The plane was cleared for takeoff. Engines roared to full power. The aircraft began rolling forward, accelerating down the runway. And then, at the worst possible moment, Captain Elizabeth Morgan saw something that made her blood turn to ice. Elizabeth had been flying for 31 years, 20 of them as captain. She'd accumulated over 24,000 flight hours, handled countless emergencies, and prided herself on split-second decision-making under pressure. Her first officer, Jake Martinez, was younger with less experience but competent and calm. Together they made a solid crew. As they'd lined up on runway 27R that evening, Elizabeth had gone through her final checks, received clearance from the tower, and advanced the throttles. The aircraft accelerated smoothly, gathering speed, 60 knots, 80 knots, approaching the point of no return where they'd be committed to take off regardless of what happened. But at 97 knots, just seconds before V1, the critical decision speed, Elizabeth saw something that shouldn't be there. On the runway ahead, perhaps 2,000 feet in front of them and closing fast, was a figure, a person, standing in the middle of the runway, directly in their path. For a fraction of a second, Elizabeth's brain refused to process what her eyes were seeing. People don't stand on active runways. It was impossible. But there it was, unmistakable even in the fading evening light, a human figure, motionless, right where her aircraft would be in approximately 8 seconds if she continued the takeoff. Elizabeth's training and instincts collided in that moment. V1 speed meant the point where rejecting takeoff became more dangerous than continuing. At high speed with limited runway remaining, aborting could send the aircraft off the end of the runway and into disaster. Standard procedure said once you reached V1, you took off regardless of what happened, handled emergencies in the air. But standard procedure didn't account for a person on the runway. If Elizabeth continued, the aircraft would either strike the person, killing them instantly, or would have to swerve to avoid them, likely causing a loss of control at high speed. If she rejected takeoff, she'd be doing it past the normal safe point, risking running out of runway, potentially killing everyone aboard. But here's what happened in the next 2 seconds that would be analyzed and debated for years. Elizabeth made a decision that violated every standard procedure, that ignored all the mathematical calculations about safe rejected takeoff speeds, that went against decades of training that drilled into pilots the absolute rule: do not reject takeoff after V1. She pulled the throttles to idle, deployed the speed brakes, and applied maximum braking. "Rejecting takeoff," she shouted to Jake, who immediately took over the radio. "Tower, Flight 637, rejecting takeoff, runway 27R, person on runway." The tower controller's voice came back in shock. "Say again, person on runway." The aircraft shuddered violently as maximum braking engaged. Passengers in the cabin were thrown forward against their seatbelts. Overhead bins burst open. Bags and coats flew forward. People screamed. Aaron felt the deceleration so intense it felt like hitting a wall. His laptop flew out of his hands and smashed into the seat in front of him. All around, passengers were crying out in fear and confusion. What was happening? Were they crashing? The nose of the aircraft pitched down under the extreme braking, giving passengers a view of the runway rushing up at them even as they decelerated. Elizabeth's eyes were locked on the runway ahead. The figure was still there, still motionless, closer now but not close enough yet. Her aircraft was slowing, rapidly but maybe not rapidly enough. The end of the runway was approaching fast. If they didn't stop in time, they'd go off the end into the grass and terrain beyond, possibly flipping, certainly destroying the landing gear, potentially killing people. The math was brutal. Elizabeth had started the rejected takeoff at 97 knots when the safe speed was typically 85 knots. She'd given herself an impossibly difficult problem: stop a 70-ton aircraft traveling at over 100 miles per hour in the remaining runway distance without hitting either the person ahead or the end of the runway. Come on," Elizabeth muttered, her feet pressing the brakes so hard her legs shook. The brake temperature gauges were rising rapidly, approaching dangerous levels. If the brakes overheated, they could catch fire or fail entirely. The auto brake system was giving her maximum deceleration, but it still might not be enough. Jake was calling out speeds. 80 knots, 70, 60. The figure on the runway was getting closer. Elizabeth could see it was a man, maybe in his 30s. just standing there, not moving, not reacting to the massive aircraft bearing down on him. Was he trying to commit suicide? Was he having a mental health crisis? It didn't matter. Elizabeth would not run him over. She would not kill him, not while she had control of her aircraft. 50 knots. The figure was 100 feet ahead now. Elizabeth could see his face, see him staring at the approaching aircraft with what looked like blank confusion rather than fear. The aircraft was still moving too fast. They were going to hit him. No, wait. 40 knots. 30. The distance was closing, but the speed was dropping faster now. 20 knots. Elizabeth felt the aircraft shudder to a stop, the tires smoking, the brakes screaming, and when she looked up, the man on the runway was 15 feet in front of her windscreen, still standing there, still staring blankly, apparently unaware of how close he'd come to being obliterated. You won't believe what happened next. Elizabeth set the parking brake, her hands shaking with adrenaline, and immediately radioed the tower. Flight 637 stopped on runway. Person directly in front of us, unresponsive. Request emergency services and security immediately. I'm shutting down engines and evacuating passengers as precaution. The tower was already mobilizing response. Airport police cars and fire trucks were racing toward the runway from multiple directions, sirens wailing. Through the cockpit window, Elizabeth watched as 2 police cars screeched to a halt near the man. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, approaching cautiously. The man didn't resist. He just stood there, blank and unresponsive, as if in a trance. In the cabin, passengers were in various states of shock and confusion. The violent rejected takeoff had terrified everyone. Some people were crying. Others were angry, demanding to know what had happened. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking for injuries. Miraculously, nobody was seriously hurt. Some bruises from the deceleration, a few bumps from falling items, but nothing requiring immediate medical attention. The lead flight attendant, Maria Rodriguez, came to the cockpit. "Captain, what's happening? Are we evacuating?" Elizabeth's voice was steady despite her shaking hands. "Not yet. Wait for emergency services to give us the all clear. There was a person on the runway. I had to reject takeoff to avoid hitting him." Maria's eyes went wide. "A person? On the runway? During our takeoff?" Elizabeth nodded grimly. "Notify the passengers. Tell them why we stopped so suddenly. They deserve to know." Maria returned to the cabin and made an announcement that silenced everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Maria. The captain rejected our takeoff because there was a person standing on the runway directly in our path. She had to brake hard to avoid striking them. That person is now being taken into custody by airport police. The captain's quick action prevented a tragedy. Please remain seated while we wait for clearance." The cabin erupted in gasps and shocked conversations. A person on the runway, during takeoff. It was incomprehensible. Aaron's mind raced trying to process it. He'd felt the violent deceleration, had been terrified they were crashing, and now learned it was because the pilot had seen someone on the runway and chosen to risk everyone aboard rather than hit that person. Aaron didn't know whether to be terrified or grateful. What if the aircraft had run off the runway? What if they'd flipped? But then, if they'd hit the person at takeoff speed, they'd have killed them and possibly caused catastrophic damage to the aircraft anyway. The captain had been choosing between terrible options in a split second. Airport police secured the man from the runway and immediately transported him to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Early reports indicated he was experiencing a severe mental health crisis, possibly a psychotic episode, and had somehow breached airport security and wandered onto an active runway without understanding where he was or the danger he was in. How he'd gotten past the perimeter fencing, past security patrols, onto a runway without being detected until the last second would be the subject of extensive investigation. But that was a problem for later. Right now, Flight 637 sat disabled on the runway, its brakes overheated and potentially damaged, 153 passengers aboard, and an entire airport disrupted. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Fire crews deployed cooling equipment on the brakes, which were smoking heavily and could ignite. The runway was closed indefinitely. Dozens of other flights were delayed or diverted as O'Hare's operations adjusted around the blockage. After 30 minutes of cooling and inspection, ground crews determined the aircraft could taxi very slowly to a gate under its own power, but it would need extensive brake inspection and likely replacement before flying again. Elizabeth taxied at walking speed to gate C-14, where passengers finally deplaned nearly 2 hours after they'd first pushed back. The disembarkation was surreal. Passengers exited into a terminal where FBI agents, airport security, airline executives, and media were already gathering. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, how someone had gotten onto a runway, whether it was terrorism or accident. Elizabeth and Jake were immediately taken to a secure room for debriefing. The FAA would need detailed statements. The NTSB would investigate. The airline needed to understand what had happened and whether protocols had been followed. Elizabeth sat in that room, still shaking from adrenaline, and answered question after question about the seconds between seeing the figure and deciding to reject takeoff past V1. Captain Morgan, the FAA investigator, said carefully, "You rejected takeoff at 97 knots. Your aircraft's V1 for this weight and conditions was 86 knots. You exceeded the safe rejected takeoff speed by 11 knots. Can you explain your decision-making process?" Elizabeth took a breath, organizing her thoughts. "I saw a person on the runway, a human being standing directly in our path. If I continued takeoff, I would either strike and kill them or attempt to swerve around them at high speed, likely losing control. If I rejected, I risked running off the runway. I chose the option where I maintained control and might save everyone, including the person on the runway. Was it by the book? No. Would I make the same decision again? Yes. I will not knowingly run over a human being with my aircraft if I have any alternative." The investigator made notes. The standard protocol is that after V1, you continue takeoff and handle emergencies in the air. You violated that protocol. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. Standard protocol doesn't account for people on the runway. Show me the procedure for persons standing motionless in your takeoff path, and I'll tell you if I followed it. But that procedure doesn't exist because that situation isn't supposed to happen. When it did happen, I made a judgment call. I chose to try saving everyone, including the person who shouldn't have been there. I'll stand by that decision regardless of what your investigation concludes. But here's what made the investigation complex. Elizabeth's decision had worked. The aircraft stopped with runway to spare. Nobody died. Nobody was even seriously injured. The man on the runway was taken alive for psychiatric treatment rather than being killed. But it could easily have gone differently. The aircraft could have run off the runway and flipped. The brakes could have failed. The deceleration could have caused injuries or worse. Elizabeth had gambled with 153 lives to save one life. Was that heroic or reckless? The aviation community was divided. Some pilots praised Elizabeth's humanity and skill. She saw a person in danger and refused to kill them even when procedure said continue. "That's the kind of pilot I want flying my plane." Others criticized her violation of established safety protocols. V1 exists for a reason. After that speed, rejected takeoff is more dangerous than continuing. She endangered everyone aboard for one person who shouldn't have been there. What if it had gone wrong? The debate raged in pilot forums, aviation publications, social media. Elizabeth Morgan became simultaneously a hero and a controversy. Aaron documented the entire incident, interviewing passengers, crew, investigators. His article, "The Captain Who Broke the Rules to Save a Life," went viral. He detailed the split-second decision, the math of rejected takeoff speeds, the impossible choice Elizabeth had faced, and the outcome where everyone survived. Aaron interviewed aviation experts who explained that Elizabeth's decision violated protocols but also demonstrated exceptional skill. She'd stopped a massive aircraft in insufficient distance through perfect brake management and nerve of steel. "Most pilots couldn't have pulled off what Morgan did," one expert said. "She knew she was exceeding safe parameters, but she also trusted her ability to manage it. That's confidence born from 31 years of experience." The man from the runway, whose name was withheld for privacy, was diagnosed with acute psychotic disorder. He'd been experiencing delusions and hallucinations for weeks before the incident, but had been hiding his symptoms from family. On the day of the incident, he'd driven to the airport believing he needed to board a plane, had walked away from his parked car, wandered through a gap in perimeter fencing that shouldn't have existed, and ended up on the runway in a dissociative state where he didn't comprehend where he was or the danger. Security camera footage showed his entire journey, 15 minutes of him walking through areas he shouldn't have accessed, not challenged once until he was standing on an active runway in front of a departing aircraft. The security failure was catastrophic. How had a man on foot breached multiple layers of airport security without detection? The investigation revealed a perfect storm of failures. The perimeter fence had a section damaged by recent construction and not yet repaired. Security cameras in that area were offline for maintenance. Patrol schedules had a gap that left the area unwatched for 20-minute windows. The man had walked through that temporary gap in security at exactly the wrong time, reaching the runway just as Flight 637 was beginning its takeoff roll. The odds of all these failures aligning were astronomical, but they had aligned, creating a nightmare scenario that should never have been possible. O'Hare Airport faced massive scrutiny and fines from the FAA for the security lapses. Perimeter fencing was reinforced and inspected daily. Camera systems were upgraded with redundancy. Patrol protocols were overhauled to eliminate gaps. What happened at O'Hare prompted a nationwide review of airport security, revealing similar vulnerabilities at other facilities that were quickly addressed. Flight 637 exposed systemic weaknesses in airport perimeter security, the FAA report concluded. While the immediate cause was one individual's mental health crisis, the underlying cause was security infrastructure that failed to prevent unauthorized access to active runways. These failures have been corrected across the national airspace system. 6 months after the incident, the FAA completed its investigation of Elizabeth Morgan's actions. The conclusion was nuanced and carefully worded. Captain Morgan's decision to reject takeoff past V1 speed violated standard operating procedures and placed the aircraft and passengers at risk. However, her assessment of the specific threat, a person directly in the takeoff path who would be struck and killed if she continued, was reasonable. Her execution of the rejected takeoff demonstrated exceptional skill, preventing both loss of life on the runway and loss of the aircraft. While we cannot recommend this course of action as standard procedure, we acknowledge that Captain Morgan faced an impossible choice and handled it with the best possible outcome. No punitive action will be taken. Elizabeth received the decision with mixed feelings. Vindication that she wouldn't be punished, but frustration that the FAA couldn't simply acknowledge she'd made the right call. They're covering themselves legally, she told Aaron in an interview. They can't officially say ignore V1 protocols when you see a person, because that creates liability, but they also couldn't punish me for saving a life. So they gave me a non-decision. No punishment, no commendation, just acknowledgement that it was complicated. I understand why, but it's frustrating. I saved that man's life and everyone else's too. I wish they could just say that. But the airline said it. At a ceremony 6 months after the incident, the airline presented Elizabeth with their highest honor for exceptional airmanship and life-saving action. The CEO spoke directly. Captain Elizabeth Morgan faced an impossible situation and made a choice that saved lives. She rejected takeoff past the prescribed safe speed to avoid striking a person on the runway. She then managed to stop her aircraft safely despite exceeding normal parameters. Every person aboard Flight 637 walked away without serious injury. The person on the runway lived to receive the psychiatric care he needed. That's not a controversy, that's heroism. We're proud to have Captain Morgan flying for us. The passengers of Flight 637 were overwhelmingly supportive. Most had written letters to the airline praising Elizabeth's actions. She risked her career and our lives to save someone who shouldn't have been there. That's compassion and courage. At the ceremony, several passengers attended to personally thank Elizabeth. Aaron was among them. Captain Morgan, I was terrified during that rejected takeoff, but when I learned why you did it, I was grateful to have been flying with someone who valued a stranger's life enough to take that risk. You're the kind of pilot I want in command. Thank you. Elizabeth hugged Aaron and the other passengers, tears in her eyes. Thank you for understanding. I was so afraid you'd all be angry, feel like I'd unnecessarily endangered you. But I couldn't hit him. I just couldn't. And I believed I could stop the aircraft safely. It was tight, it was risky, but I believed in my ability. Thank God it worked out. The ceremony was cathartic for Elizabeth, finally receiving acknowledgement and praise for a decision that had haunted her for months. She'd saved lives but had wondered if others would see it as reckless endangerment. The support from passengers and the airline helped her process the trauma of those terrible seconds when she'd gambled everything on her skill. The man whose life Elizabeth had saved, whose name remained private but whom Aaron learned was named Thomas, recovered slowly from his psychotic episode. Medication stabilized his condition. Therapy helped him process the trauma of his mental health crisis and the knowledge that he'd nearly caused a catastrophe. When he learned that a pilot had risked her career and 153 lives to avoid hitting him, Thomas was overwhelmed with guilt and gratitude. Through the airline, he asked if he could meet Elizabeth to thank her and apologize. They met 9 months after the incident, in a private room arranged by the airline. Thomas was nervous, afraid Elizabeth would hate him for putting her in that position. But Elizabeth greeted him with warmth. Thomas, I'm so glad you're doing better. What happened wasn't your fault. You were experiencing a medical crisis. I'm just grateful everyone survived, including you. Thomas broke down crying. Captain Morgan, I almost killed everyone on that plane. If you'd hit me, the aircraft could have crashed. If you'd run off the runway trying to avoid me, people could have died. I put you in an impossible situation. I'm so sorry. Elizabeth took Thomas's hands. You were ill. You didn't choose to have a psychotic break. You didn't choose to wander onto that runway. Your brain was malfunctioning through no fault of your own. I don't blame you. I hope you don't blame yourself. What matters is that everyone lived. You're getting treatment. I'm flying again. The airport fixed their security gaps. Something good came from something terrible. That's all we can ask. They talked for over an hour. Thomas sharing his journey with mental illness, Elizabeth describing her split-second decision and the months of second-guessing that followed. By the end, they'd formed an unexpected connection. 2 people bound by crisis, helping each other heal. Thomas became an advocate for mental health awareness and airport security. He spoke publicly about his experience. warning others about the importance of seeking help when experiencing psychiatric symptoms. I ignored warning signs because I was ashamed and scared. That nearly killed me and everyone on Flight 637. If you're struggling with mental health, get help. Don't hide it. Don't wait. Lives depend on it. His advocacy, combined with his story, had impact. Multiple people contacted mental health services after hearing Thomas speak, getting treatment that potentially prevented other crises. 5 years after the incident, Elizabeth was still flying, now as a senior training captain teaching other pilots about decision-making under pressure. She used Flight 637 as a case study, not to tell pilots to ignore V1 protocols, but to emphasize that rules have context. "I'm not telling you to reject takeoff past V1, she'd say to trainees. Standard protocols exist for good reasons and should be followed in virtually all circumstances, but I am telling you that aviation is complex, that sometimes situations arise that don't fit the standard procedures, and when that happens, you need to trust your judgment, your skill, and your humanity. Would I make the same decision again? Yes. Do I recommend you do what I did? Only if you face the exact same impossible choice and believe you have the skill to manage it." Decision-making isn't about rigid rule following, it's about understanding the rules, knowing when they apply, and having the judgment to act appropriately when they don't. Her teaching resonated with pilots who appreciated the nuance. Aviation was full of rules for good reason. Rules kept people safe, but Elizabeth's case demonstrated that rules served humans, not the other way around. When faced with kill a person or endanger your passengers, Elizabeth had found a third option: endanger everyone slightly but save everyone through skill. It was a masterclass in risk management and split-second judgment under pressure. 10 years after Flight 637, the incident remained one of the most studied cases in aviation decision-making. Business schools used it in classes about leadership under pressure. Ethics courses debated whether Elizabeth's decision was right. Pilot training programs around the world incorporated it into scenarios about judgment and rule application. Thomas continued his mental health advocacy, having helped hundreds of people seek treatment over the years. And Elizabeth had retired from flying, having spent her final years as a training captain, passing on wisdom earned through 3 decades of experience and one impossible decision. At her retirement ceremony, attended by hundreds of pilots she'd trained, Elizabeth reflected on her career and the moment that defined it. "I flew for 31 years, logged over 24,000 hours, experienced equipment failures, medical emergencies, weather challenges, all kinds of situations. But I'll be remembered for 7 seconds. The time between seeing a person on the runway and bringing my aircraft to a stop. 7 seconds where I broke the rules to save a life. Do I wish it had never happened? Of course. Do I wish that man had never been on my runway? Absolutely. But it did happen. He was there. And I'm proud that I valued his life enough to risk breaking the rules. That's what I want you all to remember. The rules serve our humanity, not the other way around. Follow them until your humanity demands otherwise. Then trust your judgment and your skill. That's what I did, and I do it again." The applause was thunderous. Thomas, sitting in the audience, applauded hardest. He was alive because Elizabeth had valued his life. The 153 passengers of Flight 637 were safe because Elizabeth had the skill to back up her compassion. That was leadership. That was airmanship at its highest level. That was Elizabeth Morgan. Aaron's final article about the incident, published on the 10th anniversary, was titled "The 7 Seconds That Defined a Career: Elizabeth Morgan and the Impossible Choice." He traced the entire arc from that Friday evening takeoff roll through Elizabeth's retirement, showing how one decision had rippled through systems, training, and lives. Elizabeth Morgan saw a person in danger and refused to kill them even when the rules said continue, Aaron wrote. She gambled on her skill to save everyone. And she won that gamble through 31 years of accumulated expertise and nerves of absolute steel. Her decision violated protocols but honored the deeper principle those protocols serve: protecting human life. That's the paradox of Flight 637. Elizabeth broke the rules to fulfill the ultimate purpose of the rules. She endangered everyone to save everyone. And because of her skill, it worked. 154 people lived. The 153 passengers and crew aboard, plus Thomas on the runway. All alive because one captain trusted herself enough to make an impossible choice and skilled enough to execute it perfectly. That's not just good flying. That's extraordinary humanity paired with extraordinary competence. That's Elizabeth Morgan. That's the 7 seconds that saved 154 lives and taught aviation about the limits of rules and the necessity of judgment. Flight 637 continued as a flight number for years, still operating the Chicago to San Francisco route, But passengers who knew the story would sometimes book that flight specifically, wanting to fly the route where Elizabeth Morgan had broken the rules to save lives. Flight attendants on that route would occasionally tell the story to interested passengers. The captain who saw a person on the runway made an impossible choice and brought everyone home safely. It became legend, passed down through crews, inspiring pilots to trust their judgment while respecting the protocols designed to keep them safe. Thomas lived a full life after his crisis, managing his mental health with medication and therapy, building a career as a mental health counselor helping others navigate psychiatric disorders. He married, had children, found joy despite the challenges of managing chronic mental illness. Every year on the anniversary of the incident, he'd write Elizabeth a letter thanking her for his life. Every year she'd write back reminding him that she was just doing her job, that he deserved to live, that his illness wasn't his fault. Their correspondence continued until Elizabeth's death at age 82, a collection of letters that Thomas preserved as a reminder of grace, compassion, and the human ability to choose life even when rules suggest otherwise. Elizabeth Morgan's grave marker bore a simple inscription chosen by her family: Captain, Teacher, Lifesaver. She broke the rules for the right reasons. Thomas attended the funeral, along with dozens of the passengers from Flight 637, along with hundreds of pilots Elizabeth had trained over the years. They gathered to honor a woman who demonstrated that the highest form of rule following was knowing when to break the rules in service of humanity. That was Elizabeth's legacy. Not the thousands of safe flights, though those mattered, but the one flight where she chose compassion over compliance and skill backed up that choice. That was the flight. Those were the 7 seconds that defined who she was and what she stood for. And somewhere in the archives of aviation safety, in the case files and training materials, Flight 637 lived on: the impossible situation, the rule-breaking decision, the perfect execution, the lives saved. A reminder to every pilot that sometimes the rules don't cover reality, and when they don't, judgment matters more than compliance. A reminder that compassion backed by competence can save lives in ways rules never anticipate. A reminder that Elizabeth Morgan saw a person where she should have seen an obstacle, saw a life where protocol saw a violation, saw humanity where others might have seen only numbers. She chose life, she trusted herself, and 154 people lived because she did. That's the story of Flight 637. That's the legacy of Elizabeth Morgan. That's why 7 seconds on a runway changed aviation and saved lives. Because one captain refused to let rules override humanity and had the skill to make that refusal succeed. We should all be so brave. We should all value life so highly. We should all trust ourselves that completely when the moment demands it. That's the lesson. That's the gift. That's why Elizabeth Morgan's story matters, and always will.